The room went completely silent. I mean that literally. Not a single person at that table made a sound. Freddie, my boss's boss, the man who had spent the better part of a year treating me like a replaceable piece of furniture, was staring at the folder I had just placed in the center of the conference table. His face had gone the color of old concrete. His mouth was open, but nothing was coming out. The HR director was already flipping through the pages. The regional operations manager, who had flown in from the American headquarters specifically for this meeting, was leaning forward with his glasses pushed up his nose, reading very carefully. And I just sat there. Hands folded. Completely calm. Because I had been waiting for this moment for nearly 10 months. And I had made absolutely sure that when it came, I would not need to say a single word. But to understand why that silence felt like the best sound I had ever heard in my professional life, we need to go back to January of 2021, and a factory floor in Europe where the rules of basic competence and basic decency had both been quietly retired years before I ever walked through the door. I want to be honest with you from the start. I am not the most socially warm person you will ever meet. I do not do small talk particularly well, I do not enjoy office politics, and I have what my colleagues have generously described as a cold professional attitude. I take rules seriously. I take my work seriously. And when I commit to doing a job properly, I do it properly, not because I want recognition, but because that is simply who I am. I knew all of that about myself when I took the job. What I did not know was that those exact qualities were going to make me a target. The company was a large American corporation operating a manufacturing facility in Europe, specifically in the energy sector. The work they did there was remarkably specialized. Gas turbine components, rotary blades, vanes, all the internal parts that get subjected to years of extreme heat and mechanical stress, would be sent to this facility to be assessed, measured, and restored. A brand new turbine component could cost between 2 and 8,000 euros per piece. Restoring it cost roughly a quarter of that. And since a single gas turbine contained thousands of person components, you can start to imagine the scale of money flowing through this one facility every single year. Customers saved a significant amount compared to ordering new parts. The company made a very healthy margin. Everyone was happy. Except that kind of guaranteed, uncontested income, sustained over decades without serious competition, has a way of doing something very specific to the people managing it. It makes them lazy. It makes them comfortable. And eventually, it makes them dangerous, because they start to believe that the money will keep flowing no matter what they do or do not do. Competence stops being rewarded. Honesty stops being valued. And what fills the space where those things used to be is something much uglier: cliques, favoritism, and the protection of people who do not deserve to be protected. That was the environment I walked into. My specific role was in quality control, operating a three-dimensional computer-managed measuring machine. If you are not familiar with this kind of equipment, let me give you a quick picture. Gas turbine blades operate under extraordinary conditions for years at a time, and that process deforms them, subtly, but enough to matter. Before those blades can be restored and returned to service, they have to be measured with extreme precision so that the production team knows exactly what needs to be corrected on each person piece, and whether a given blade is too far gone to restore at all. The measuring machine did that work. It ran 2 to 3 shifts a day, 6 days a week. Roughly 80% of every component that passed through that facility had to go through that machine at least twice. Operating the machine itself was not complicated. You load the blade, clamp it into the bracket, select the correct measurement program, and let it run. The machine produces a report, a text file, an Excel sheet, a PDF, and when an entire set of blades has been measured, you compile all those person reports into one master Excel document using a method that took me about a week to learn properly. But operating a machine and truly understanding it are two entirely different things. And that distinction, it turned out, was going to become very important. There were 3 people at that facility who genuinely understood the measuring machine at a deep level. One of them was a technician named Vladimir, who could actually repair the machine's code and reprogram its 3-dimensional models when something went wrong. Vladimir was also responsible for the entire facility's technical infrastructure, which made him an extremely busy man. Every hour he spent at the measuring machine had to be billed to the department, and the department managers discouraged that expense loudly and often. The second person who really knew the machine was a man I will call Antonio. Antonio had been working at that facility for what felt like decades, long enough to know every quirk, every fault, every maintenance requirement of every major piece of equipment in the building. He was a floor worker, not a manager, but he was the kind of person that everyone with any sense goes to when something goes seriously wrong. He had a short temper and a very direct way of expressing himself, but underneath that he was honest, fair, and genuinely excellent at his job. We argued a few times in the early weeks, but we understood each other in the way that 2 people who share the same core principles tend to understand each other quickly. What I did not know when I met Antonio was that he had, over his long career, accumulated such an extraordinary backlog of unused overtime and leave days that he was entitled to retire 2 full years before his actual retirement date, and he was already 63. He had decided to use his remaining time to pass on everything he knew about the measuring machine to someone he trusted. That person turned out to be me. He taught me not just how to operate it, but how to maintain it properly, how to diagnose problems, what the machine was actually doing at each stage of its process, and how to catch issues before they became catastrophes. I took every single piece of that knowledge seriously, because that is what I do. The third person connected to the measuring machine was a man I will call Igor. Igor was, to put it plainly, not there because he was good at the job. He was there because his brother, a man I will call Boris, was the manager of the entire assessment department. Boris was close friends with Freddy, who was the manager above my direct supervisor Manuel. This triangle, Boris, Freddy, and Manuel, formed the core of the most powerful clique in the facility. And Igor sat comfortably inside that protection, doing the night shift because it paid more, doing as little as possible because no one in a position of authority was ever going to hold him accountable for anything. Antonio described Igor to me once in terms I will not fully repeat here, but the summary was that Igor was someone who had confused being untouchable with being competent, and that combination made him genuinely dangerous in a technical environment. I filed that assessment away and tried to stay out of his way. That was my first mistake. You cannot stay out of the way of someone who operates the same machine as you on a different shift, because what they do on their shift lands directly in your lap when you arrive in the morning. Let me tell you about the early warning sign I missed. About 3 months into the job, I came in one morning to find the measurement log for the previous night's shift was incomplete. Igor had measured most of a set of blades but had stopped 2 pieces short of finishing. This happened regularly. He had a habit of leaving the last 1 or 2 pieces of any set for the next shift, which meant I always had to clean up the tail end of his work before starting my own. I mentioned it to Antonio, who just shook his head and said something in his direct way that I will paraphrase as, "He has been doing that for years and no one has ever made him stop." I noted it. I moved on. I should not have moved on. Because what I did not fully appreciate yet was that this was not laziness for its own sake. This was a pattern of behavior that existed precisely because the people above him would never enforce any standard of accountability. Igor was not just avoiding work. He was testing what he could get away with. And every time no one pushed back, the ceiling of what he could get away with rose a little higher. Looking back, I should have understood that then. The first real incident came about 6 months after I started. The protocol for the measuring machine was clear and well established. Rotary blades always had to be sorted in numerical order by serial number and set number before measurement. When an order arrived unsorted, the operator measuring them was responsible for sorting them as they worked through the set. It added a small amount of time and effort, but it was not a significant burden. It was simply the rule. One morning I came in to find 3 blades left from the previous shift's order. Again, Igor's signature move of leaving just enough to force the next person to deal with the changeover. But when I went to start sorting the new pallets, I found them in complete disorder. Igor had measured the entire order without sorting a single piece. 4 pallets of blades, completely scrambled. Sorting them while also running the machine on the new order took me 2 solid hours of physical work, lifting blades, cross-referencing serial numbers, reorganizing. By the end of it I was sweating and genuinely irritated. When Igor arrived for the afternoon shift, I asked him, as calmly as I could manage, why he had not sorted the order. He told me, in a tone that made clear he found the question beneath him, that he was not going to do that. I asked if he understood that sorting was a mandatory part of the process. He told me he was not going to discuss it further. I told him that if he would not discuss it, I would have to raise it with our supervisor. He smiled, and it was a very specific kind of smile, the smile of someone who knows exactly who his brother is and exactly who his brother's best friend is, and told me to go ahead. So I did. What followed was a 4-person meeting with my direct supervisor Manuel, Boris, Igor, and me. It was immediately clear to everyone in that room that I was factually correct about the sorting requirement. It was equally clear that neither Manuel nor Boris had any intention of saying so out loud in a way that reflected badly on Igor. The meeting ended with a vague request that operators please try to sort pallets when possible. Igor shrugged. The matter was considered closed. It happened 3 more times after that. Igor never sorted a single pallet. The second incident was more serious. Every morning before I started measuring, I performed a maintenance routine on the machine that Antonio had drilled into me during my training. Part of that routine involved running the measurement arch, the large moving arm that carries the measurement probe across the work surface, to the far end of its track so I could clean and lubricate the stone surface it ran on. The arch itself operated on an air cushion system, similar in principle to a hovercraft. A thin layer of pressurized air kept the bottom of the arch fractionally above the stone surface, allowing it to move with almost no friction and so with maximum precision. One morning, about 6 weeks after the sorting incident, I started the maintenance routine and heard a grinding sound the moment the arch began to move. I stopped it immediately. When I inspected the stone track, I found a crater. It was roughly 2 to 3 centimeters deep and wide, large enough that when the arch passed over it, the air cushion lost pressure and the arch's base was making direct contact with the stone. Further inspection showed scratch marks running along nearly the entire length of the track, which meant the machine had been operating with this damage for a significant amount of time. The shape of the crater was consistent with the corner of a turbine blade being dropped directly onto the stone surface. The shift before mine had been Igor's. I shut the machine down immediately. I called Vladimir. I informed my supervisor. And before I did any of that, I took photographs of the damage with my phone, including the automatic timestamp that recorded the exact time and date. Not because I had a specific plan. Just because I had developed, by that point, a very strong instinct that documentation was going to matter eventually. The machine was taken out of commission. The stone track had to be completely resurfaced. The arch had sustained damage and needed recalibration. The entire repair process took over a month, during which the facility's measurement capacity was severely reduced. Igor denied everything. He claimed he had not dropped any blade. He claimed he had not heard any grinding. He attempted, briefly, to suggest that I might have caused the damage when I arrived that morning. That attempt lasted about 30 seconds, because the timestamps on my photographs showed I had reported the damage within 5 minutes of my shift starting, with the last blade Igor had measured still physically sitting in the machine's clamp. The timeline made his story impossible. And yet, no disciplinary action. No written warning. Not even, as far as I could tell, a serious conversation behind closed doors. Boris protected his brother. Freddy protected Boris. Manuel, who answered to Freddy, stayed very quiet. This was the moment I understood that the problem was not Igor. Igor was simply the most visible symptom. The real problem was a management structure that had decided, years before I arrived, that accountability was optional for people inside the right circle. During the month the machine was out of service, I was reassigned to other tasks. Antonio used some of that time to continue my education about the machine's deeper systems, the calibration protocols, the model files, the error codes that Vladimir usually handled. He was not doing this randomly. He was doing it because he had already decided I was going to be the person who kept that machine running after he was gone, and he wanted me to be ready for everything. I want to be clear about something. During all of this, I did not complain loudly. I did not make scenes. I did not go around telling colleagues what I thought of Igor or of the management above me. I did my job, I documented what I saw, and I spoke up through proper channels when something needed to be raised. Every time I was ignored or overruled, I went back to my workstation and kept doing my job. I was not building a case deliberately at that point. I was simply being who I am. But the documentation was accumulating. The third incident changed everything. About 2 months after the machine came back online, I arrived one morning to find that the measurement program running on the machine was the wrong one. Igor had measured an entire night's worth of blades. I believe it was somewhere around 40 pieces, using a program calibrated for a different blade model. The measurements were not just inaccurate. They were meaningless. Every single blade from that shift would have to be remeasured. What made this worse was the compiled report. Or rather, the absence of one. Igor had not compiled the person measurement reports into the master Excel document, a task he was required to complete at the end of his shift. The reports were sitting in the machine's output folder as person files, unprocessed, with no summary document. When I realized what had happened, I checked the job order log. The blades from that shift were scheduled to move to the restoration stage that afternoon. If no one had caught this, 40 components with fabricated measurement data would have moved into active production. In an industry where precision measurement exists specifically to ensure the safety of equipment that generates power for thousands of people, that is not a minor administrative error. That is a serious quality control failure. I documented everything. I photographed the screen showing the wrong program. I saved the output files with their timestamps. I wrote a formal incident report and submitted it to Manuel. Manuel sat on it for 3 days. When I followed up, he told me it was being reviewed. When I followed up again a week later, he told me the matter had been addressed internally. No further details. I asked Antonio what he thought. He looked at me for a long moment and then said, very quietly for a man who was usually anything but quiet, that I needed to be careful. He told me that Freddy had been asking questions about me, not positive ones. He told me that Boris had been telling people I was difficult, that I caused problems, that I was the kind of employee who made mountains out of molehills. He told me that the clique had noticed me, and that being noticed by them was not a good thing. That night, I sat down at my kitchen table after the hour and 45-minute commute home and I made a decision. I was not going to quit. I was not going to back down. But I was going to stop being passive about my documentation. From that point forward, every incident, every deviation from protocol, every anomalous measurement result, every time a compiled report was missing, every time a maintenance log entry was absent, I was going to record it, date it, and keep a copy somewhere that was not on the company's systems. I also sent myself an email that night. Just a summary of everything that had happened so far, with all the dates I could recall and the photographs I had already taken. I sent it from my personal email to my personal email. The timestamp on that email was automatic and permanent. Over the next 3 months, my file grew. I logged 12 separate instances of Igor failing to compile measurement reports. I documented 6 occasions where pallets were left unsorted in violation of the standing protocol. I noted 3 instances where maintenance log entries were missing for Igor's shifts, entries that were required by both company procedure and, more importantly, by the quality certification standards the facility operated under. I had photographs, file timestamps, job order records cross-referenced against measurement output logs. I had a clear, chronological, evidence-based record of a pattern of negligence that had been actively ignored by 3 levels of management. And then Freddie made his move. I should have seen it coming, but I did not see the specific shape of it until it was already happening. Freddie called me into his office one afternoon in late September. Manuel was there. Boris was there. Igor was not, which I noted. Freddie was the kind of manager who had learned, over many years, how to deliver bad news in a tone that suggested he was doing you a favor. He had a very practiced expression of concerned professionalism that never quite reached his eyes. He told me that he had been reviewing the department's performance and that some concerns had been raised about my attitude and my ability to work as part of a team. He mentioned, carefully, without specifics, that there had been complaints. He said that the department needed people who were collaborative and who understood that sometimes processes evolved and flexibility was required. I sat there and listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he told me that if I could not show a more cooperative approach, he would have to consider whether my position was still the right fit for the department. In other words, fall in line, stop documenting, stop raising issues, or be fired. My throat was dry. My hands were perfectly still on my knees. I looked at him and I said, in a very even voice, that I appreciated him being direct with me. I asked him to confirm, for my own clarity, that he was suggesting my employment might be terminated if I continued to follow the company's documented quality control procedures and reporting requirements. Freddie's expression shifted very slightly. He said that was not what he had said. I said I wanted to make sure I understood him correctly, and I asked again. He said that I should focus on being a better team player. I thanked him for his time and left the office. I walked directly to my car, sat in the driver's seat for about 4 minutes, and then called Antonio. I told him exactly what had been said. He was quiet for a moment and then told me that Freddie had done this before, to other people, years ago. He told me the last person Freddie had pressured like this had resigned within 2 weeks. Then Antonio said something that I have not forgotten. He said, "You have something those other people did not have. You have a paper trail. Use it." I went home that night and I contacted an employment lawyer. I laid out the situation and asked 2 questions. First, did what Freddie had said constitute a threat of retaliation for protected workplace activity? Second, what was the correct procedure for escalating a quality control concern beyond facility management level in a company with a U.S. parent corporation? The answers to both questions were very useful. The following week, I did something that I had been thinking about for months but had not yet done. I identified the name and contact information of the Regional Operations Director, a senior figure at the American headquarters who had oversight responsibility for the European manufacturing facilities. I also identified the name of the company's European Quality Compliance Officer, whose role existed specifically to ensure that facilities met the certification standards their quality agreements required. I spent 2 evenings organizing my documentation into a clear, professional report. Not emotional. Not accusatory in tone. Just factual. Dates. Incident descriptions. Photographic evidence. File timestamps. Cross-references to the specific procedural requirements that had not been followed. A clear log showing that these incidents had been reported to facility management and the outcomes of each report. And at the end, a brief, neutral summary of the conversation with Freddie, framed as a potential concern about retaliation for quality reporting activity. I printed 2 copies. I kept one at home. The other I sealed in an envelope. And then I emailed the entire document, every page, every photograph, every timestamp, to both the Regional Operations Director and the European Quality Compliance Officer. From my personal email account, so there was no possibility of it being intercepted or deleted at the facility level. I sent it on a Sunday evening. The email had a clear subject line that referenced the facility's quality certification number and the words "Compliance Concern, Formal Notification." I went to work on Monday morning and I said nothing to anyone. For 2 days, nothing happened visibly. On Wednesday morning, Antonio pulled me aside near the machine and told me, in a very low voice, that there had been phone calls. He did not know the details, but the facility director, who was above even Freddie in the local hierarchy, had been in a long call with someone from the American side on Tuesday afternoon, and his expression coming out of that call had been something Antonio described with a single word that I will leave to your imagination. On Thursday, I received an email from the HR department requesting my presence at a meeting the following Monday. The email listed the regional operations manager as an attendee. It also listed a name I did not recognize, who I later confirmed was the European Quality Compliance Officer. Freddie's name was on the attendee list too. So was Boris's. So was Manuel's. I printed my documentation again, punched holes in it, and put it into a clean presentation folder. I drove to work on Monday morning with that folder on the passenger seat next to me. The commute was an hour and 45 minutes each way, as I mentioned. I used the drive to think about nothing in particular. I had done everything I needed to do. There was nothing left to prepare. The meeting was in the main conference room. When I walked in, Freddie was already seated. He looked at me with the expression of someone who was very carefully maintaining control of their face. Boris was 2 seats down from him, looking at his phone. Manuel was looking at the table. The HR director was at one end. The regional operations manager, who had indeed flown in from the American side, was at the other end, and next to him was the quality compliance officer, a woman I had only known previously as an email signature. I sat down, placed my folder on the table in front of me, and folded my hands on top of it. The HR director opened the meeting by saying it had been called to discuss some concerns that had been raised about quality compliance practices at the facility. She said the meeting was formal and that notes would be taken. She asked if anyone had any opening comments. Freddie said, in a measured tone, that he felt the concerns that had been raised reflected a misunderstanding of how the facility managed its internal processes, and that he was confident the team could clarify everything. The regional operations manager nodded and said he was sure that would be very helpful, and then he looked at me and asked if I had anything I wanted to add. I said yes. I opened the folder and I placed it in the center of the table. Nobody said anything for what felt like a very long time. The quality compliance officer pulled the folder toward her first. She started from the beginning and read carefully, the way someone reads when they are building a picture in their head as they go. The regional operations manager leaned over and began reading alongside her. The HR director had her own copy, I had brought 3, and was cross-referencing dates. I watched Freddie's face. He had started the meeting projecting the calm authority of a senior manager who expects to be the most important person in the room. That projection lasted about 90 seconds. As the quality compliance officer turned the first few pages and her expression became progressively more still and focused, I watched Freddie's careful composure start to develop small cracks. His jaw tightened. He glanced at Boris. Boris was staring at the folder with the expression of someone watching a building they thought was stable begin to lean. Manuel had gone very pale. The quality compliance officer looked up from the folder and addressed the room. She confirmed that several of the documented failures, specifically the missing maintenance log entries and the incorrect measurement program incident, represented direct violations of the facility's quality certification agreement. She said those violations, if confirmed, would need to be reported to the certification body. She also noted that the documentation showed a clear pattern of incidents being reported to management and not actioned, which raised additional concerns about the facility's internal compliance culture. The regional operations manager asked Freddie if he had a response. Freddie said that the incidents had been reviewed and handled at the facility level. The operations manager asked how they had been handled. Freddie said that the relevant parties had been spoken to. The operations manager asked if there were written records of those conversations. The silence that followed that question was different from the first silence. The first silence had been shock. This silence was the sound of an answer that did not exist. The meeting lasted 3 hours. I spoke when I was asked to speak. I clarified dates and details when asked. I did not editorialize. I did not express anger. I simply confirmed what the documents showed, because the documents showed everything that needed to be shown. By the end of that meeting, the quality compliance officer had identified that a formal external audit of the facility's quality processes would be required. The regional operations manager had made clear that the pattern of management failures documented in my report could not be attributed to oversight alone. The HR director had noted the conversation I had described with Freddie, the one where he had implied my position was at risk if I continued raising quality concerns, and had flagged it as a potential compliance issue in its own right. I drove home that afternoon in a very specific kind of quiet. Over the following 3 weeks, the external audit was conducted. I was interviewed. Vladimir was interviewed. Antonio was interviewed, and I am told he was very thorough in his account of events, in the direct and unfiltered way that was entirely characteristic of him. The audit identified multiple documentation failures across the measurement department and raised formal concerns about the management oversight structure. Freddie was removed from his position. The formal language used was restructuring, but Antonio, who had worked there long enough to know the difference between restructuring and being shown the door, told me the distinction was cosmetic. Boris was dismissed. The incorrect measurement program incident, 40 components that could have entered production with invalid quality data, was the specific anchor point for that outcome. When the quality certification implications were fully laid out, the company had no defensible position for retaining the person whose negligence had caused it and whose supervisor had failed to action the incident report. Manuel was placed on a formal performance review and moved to a different department. Igor was transferred off the measuring machine entirely and reassigned to a general labor role with no access to quality critical equipment. The night shift premium he had been collecting disappeared with the transfer. Antonio retired, on schedule, about 6 weeks after all of this concluded. On his last day he found me at the machine and shook my hand and said something to me that I will not share here because it was between the two of us and some things are not for public consumption. But I will say that it was kind, and that from Antonio, that meant more than most things. I kept my job. More than that, I was asked to take on an expanded role with formal responsibility for the measurement department's quality documentation processes. The commute was still an hour and 45 minutes each way, and that never stopped being difficult. But I drove it differently after October of 2021. I think about that conference room sometimes. I think about the moment I placed the folder on the table and stepped back and let the work speak for itself. I did not shout. I did not accuse. I did not make it personal. I just showed up with the truth, organized and time-stamped and impossible to argue with, and I let it do what the truth does when it is presented clearly and calmly to people with the authority to act on it. There is a version of this story where I stayed quiet. Where Freddy's warning in that office worked the way it had worked on people before me. Where I decided the commute was not worth the fight, packed my things, and left. That version of the story ends with Igor still on the night shift, still collecting his premium pay, still dropping blades on precision measurement surfaces and leaving the consequences for someone else to deal with. Freddy still managing. Boris still protecting his brother. The same unaccountable circle, intact and untouchable. I am glad I am not in that version of the story. I did not set out to get anyone fired. I set out to do my job properly and to document what I saw because documentation is what professionals do when things go wrong. What happened to Freddy, to Boris, to Manuel, that was the result of their own choices, playing out to their logical conclusion when someone finally put all the evidence in front of people who could not ignore it. So I will ask you what I genuinely want to know: was I wrong to escalate the way I did? Or did 3 men who had spent years protecting negligence at the expense of everyone around them finally get exactly what their choices had earned them? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one.